Remember, the 5th of November, the Gunpowder Treason and Plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up King and Parliament. 70 barrels were laid below to prove old England's overthrow. By God's mercy he was catched with a dark lantern and lighted match. Holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the King.
Welcome back to our third and final part, looking at our main protagonist himself, Sir Everard Digby, and this part encompasses flight, surrender, trial and execution. On the 6th of November, the fugitives raided Warwick Castle, where they managed to secure more horses before moving on to Norbrook to collect stored weapons. From there they continued toward Huddington. Catesby ordered his servant and fellow plotter Thomas Bates to deliver a letter to Father Garnet at Coulton Court. Catesby and Digby asked Father Garnet to excuse their recklessness before asking for his help in raising an army in Wales. Garnet's reply begged them to stop their wickedness and to listen to the Pope's teachings. When the priest tried to comfort Mary Digby, also at Coulton Court, she burst into tears. With their ever-decreasing band of supporters, the fugitives arrived at Huddington at about 2 p.m. Any expectation they had of support began to vanish very, very quickly. Almost everyone they met with showed concern only for their own safety, fearful of being involved with traitors. The next morning they rode through the rain, stopping briefly to help themselves to supplies from the home of the absent Lord Windsor at Hewell Grange. Still the locals refused to have anything to do with them. Digby later admitted that not one man joined them. They arrived that night at Holbeach House, which is on the border of Staffordshire, and tired and desperate and soaking wet, they spread out some of the now soaked gunpowder in front of the fire to dry it out. A spark from the fire landed on the powder, and the resultant flames engulfed Catesby, Rookwood, Grant and another man. They were a bit bungling, and it has actually been said that before, and it's wow, it just really wasn't going to work, this. Catesby and fellow conspirators Thomas Percy, John Wright and his brother Christopher were killed by the Sheriff of Worcester's men early on the 8th of November, but Digby had already left to give himself up, the only conspirator to do so. With 2 servants, possibly Bates and his son, he took several horses and hid in a nearby woods. Their tracks were soon found. However, and with some hesitation, Digby had intended to surrender himself to someone of a more worthy stature, so he didn't want to be surrendering himself to no common oik. Early that morning, he presented himself to the most senior looking of his adversaries. While Digby was taken to the Tower of London, Gayhurst was ransacked, the servants' belongings were stolen, the livestock was sold cheaply and Mary Digby was left destitute. The sheriff later remarked, "All goods are carried away, even the very floor of the great parlour." At the Tower, Digby's 2 trunks of clothing were searched and found to contain £100 in gold coins and £50 in white money, which is silver coins. William Wade, Lieutenant of the Tower, asked if he could take £50 to pay for Digby's food and bedding. Sir Everard unsuccessfully sought an audience with King James to try and explain himself, in the historian Fraser's opinion suggesting either that the extent of his involvement was limited or that he was so astonishingly naive and trusting of his sovereign's forgiveness. While imprisoned, he busied himself with writing secret letters smuggled from the Tower and not rediscovered until Kenelm Digby's death, that's Sir Everard Digby's son, in 1665. Although he was fortunate not to suffer the fate of Guy Fawkes, who was tortured on several occasions, one of those letters hints that it had been in a fashion offered to him, so he'd been threatened, basically. He described his refusal to cooperate with his interrogators, boasted of his deceit, and how there was nothing he could do to make the plot appear less abhorrent to fellow Catholics. Digby also carved an inscription on his cell wall, which as of 1996 is extant. Certainly not lucky the end he came to, but how he was treated was very, very different to Guy Fawkes. Digby was lucky to escape torture, Guy Fawkes wasn't, and what we're looking at here is an example of before and after torture. At the top you see Guy Fawkes' signature before he was tortured, and below that you see the signature after he was tortured, and he'd been so badly racked that the lieutenant or the governor, whoever it was, had to actually hold his hand so he could write. That's how severely he'd been racked, and when he was taken to his death, he was in such a state that he more or less had to be carried there. So, in a sense, Digby was lucky to have escaped this fate. In December 1605, Sir Everard's wife, Mary Digby, wrote to the Earl of Salisbury, complaining that the Sheriff of Buckinghamshire had allowed people to strip their house for his own profit, even her closet, and had not allowed them any of their clothes or linen. She entreated him for the life of her husband and his intercession with King James. Sir Everard Digby was tried on the same day as 7 of his surviving co-conspirators in Westminster Hall on Monday the 27th of January 1606, as the king and his family sit and watched in secret. The charges against the plotters were read out aloud for all to hear. Of all the surviving plotters that were tried, Sir Everard Digby was the only one to plead guilty, and he was tried on a separate indictment. Dressed in satin black, a suit, and a taffety gown, he gave a short and moving speech defending his actions by explaining his affection for Catesby and the cause of his religion. He accused King James of reneging on his promises of toleration for Catholics, and told of his fears of harsher laws against the recusy. He also pleaded on behalf of his family that they should not pay for his actions, before making a final request to be beheaded. His words fell on mostly deaf ears. The prosecution poured scorn on James's supposed perfidy and ridiculed Digby for asking for leniency where he would have given none. Along with the other plotters, he was found guilty. They were all found guilty. As they were led from the hall, Digby exclaimed, "If I may but hear any of your lordships say, 'You forgive me,' I shall go more cheerfully to the gallows." The reply came back, "May God forgive you," and we do. Sir Everard spent his last few days in the tower, in the area where I was, where it's believed he was imprisoned, writing letters to his wife and to his sons, urging the two boys to avoid the examples set by figures such as Cain and Abel. He also wrote poetry, a small example of which I'm going to read to you now. Who's that which knocks? I'll stay, my lord, I come. I know that call, since first it made me know myself, which makes me now with joy to run. Lest he be gone, that can my duty show. Jesu, my Lord, I know thee by the cross. Thou offerest me, but not unto my loss. Digby was hanged, drawn and quartered on early Thursday the 30th of January. Throngs of spectators lined the streets as he was strapped to a wattle hurdle alongside Robert Winter, John Grant, and was dragged by horse to the western end of Old St Paul's churchyard. Thomas Bates was delivered in a similar fashion, but from the Gatehouse prison. Armed guards interspersed along the route were there to defend against any possible rescue, but did not keep the miscreants' families from witnessing the fate of the four men. Cold and grubby, Digby was the first of the four to face the executioner. He mounted the scaffold and addressed the audience, telling them that he knew he had broken the law, but that morally and in the eyes of his religion he had committed no offence. He asked for God's forgiveness and for the country's, and protested the Jesuits and Father Gerard's innocence. He refused the attentions of a Protestant clergyman, speaking to himself in Latin before saying goodbye to his friends. Sir Everard was then stripped of his clothing, except for his shirt, murmuring, "Oh Jesus, Jesus save me and keep me." He climbed the ladder and was hanged for a short period. The executioner cut the rope, and Digby fell back to the scaffold, wounding his forehead in the process. Fully conscious, he was taken to the block and castrated, disemboweled and quartered. Winter, Grant and Bates followed. The remaining four conspirators suffered similar fates the following day at Old Palace Yard in Westminster, mere metres away from where the terrible crime had been planned to happen. The hanging, drawing and quartering process in those days was a revolting thing, and it was done for several reasons. One, as a terrible lesson to the guilty and to those watching, as this is what will happen to you if you do this. And two, as you can see here, the bodies were cut into quarters, literally, the heads taken off, and those heads were stuck up on spikes. Sir Everard's head is amongst these ones here. And a lot of the worst criminals or traitors, their heads would have been put up on spikes on London Bridge. And the other parts of the body were sent to the four corners of the kingdom to be put up or nailed up there as warnings to people. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our Gunpowder Treason and Plot through the eyes and unfortunate experiences of Sir Everard Digby. I hope you all found this interesting or informative. If you did, please give it a like and a share. Thanks very much for watching.
Remember, the 5th of November, the Gunpowder Treason and Plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up king and parliament. 70 barrels were laid below to prove old England's overthrow. By God's mercy he was catched with a dark lantern and lighted match. Holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king.